Quite a lot of what we have talked about on the podcast has been focused on events purely in the city of Rome, and especially with the major players in what would become Rome's first imperial dynasty. But during the reign of the Pax Romana's fourth emperor, that's Claudius, Roman legions invaded the island of Great Britain, and this new conquest really gives us an opportunity to finally consider a major event outside the city of Rome, and really to better understand just how dominant Rome was in this period. Claudius never had the Senate on his side, but his successes in Great Britain made many Romans feel like Rome was back to winning again, that lost glory was being restored. Now, why did the Romans want to conquer Britain, and how did they do it? We'll answer those questions on this episode of the Pax Romana Podcast. Episode 14, British Invasion. Thus far, I've been posting 2 episodes of the Pax Romana podcast every week. My plan is to continue that for the most part, but for the next month or so, I'm coming on a period in which I'm going to be doing some speaking engagements, both scholarly and public, and also some travel, and so it's just not going to be possible to do 2 episodes a week. So for the month of October, and then through at least the first half of November, you'll get 1 episode per week. These episodes will have a bit more detail. The pace is going to be a little bit slower. You've got a sense of what has happened now in the first 100 years or so of the Pax Romana. So we're going to spend some time looking a bit deeper and a bit longer into what's happening both in Rome and outside. And in some ways, that's what we're doing today in the discussion of Great Britain. I hope you enjoy the episode. Let's get started. As far as the Romans were concerned, Britain was at the edge of the world. Its pale, painted people, some of them long-haired and maybe even bare-chested, seemed almost inhuman to the Romans. The Romans were used to the coastal world of the often calm and warm Mediterranean Sea, what they called our sea. This was a world of cities and dry summers and crisp sea breezes and olive-skinned people. But Britain was an alien land. It was wet and it was cold. It was a land of darkness, of foreboding forests, of swampy marshes, deep inland, far from the cold and violent ocean that surrounded the island of Great Britain. Claudius gets the credit for ultimately conquering Great Britain, and some of that is deserved. At least his subordinates deserve that honor. But even those men who won Great Britain under Claudius stood on the shoulders of many Romans that came before them, including one of the leaders that we have already met on this podcast, and that's Julius Caesar. But even before we talk about Caesar's invasion of Britain, let's talk about who the Britons were, especially those that the Romans would have encountered in the southern part of the island. What were these people like, and how did they live? Well, from what we can tell from archaeological evidence and some of the descriptions that the Romans have provided us, and also a few British accounts, but from much, much, much later, centuries later, it seems like southern British people were in part nomadic, part migratory, but actually the land there was somewhat conducive to the raising of livestock, and there's quite a bit of evidence of permanent settlements based around agriculture. There are even indications that the pre-Roman Britons in the south of the island formed what we might call towns with large halls that had sprung up, and these places seem to be most prominent at kind of natural confluence points in the trading networks in the island. So places where rivers could easily be crossed by land routes, or places where multiple land routes would run into each other, crossroads and the like. The Romans would eventually pave Britain with straight, impressively engineered roads, but before the Romans, the British people had developed a pretty impressive network of pathways that would move across regions and allow people to traverse vast stretches of countryside, mostly for purposes of trade. And for those that weren't linked up to the trade networks in southern Britain, they tended to supply themselves in a kind of self-sufficient way. They might have a few livestock, gardens, that sort of thing. We see evidence of round houses with thatched roofs, sometimes built of wood, at other times built of stone. And these people also circulated coinage, some of which was imported from Celtic peoples in the European continent, but also some coins that seem to be fashioned after Greek coins that go back all the way to the father of Alexander the Great, Philip II, centuries before the Romans had even imagined what Britain might look like. But I should mention, because I do work on coinage and money, that I don't think that this coinage was used as money. It was not used in the same way that Romans used coin. But really, these were almost like medallions or trophies that British chieftains or other leaders would pass out to people as rewards or as tokens of loyalty. I don't want to give the impression that Great Britain had a monetized economy prior to the Romans arriving there. I'm not really convinced that that's the case. And despite the fact that the Britons were on an island, they were not isolated from the other Celtic peoples that lived in Western Europe. So just like those people, the Britons seem to have been largely tribal people, ruled by kings or chieftains, leaders that were acclaimed by local groups of people. There were also druids that wandered across tribal boundaries and through different settlements. We don't know as much as we would like about the druids. They were part priests, but also political power brokers and diplomats, and maybe even historians. And because the pre-Roman British people were connected with the Celtic peoples on the continent of Europe, the Romans ended up learning about them from those people. And the Britons ended up learning about the Romans in the same way. But as far as we know, the first Roman soldiers to actually cross the English Channel and set foot upon the island of Great Britain were not soldiers of the Emperor Claudius, but, as I indicated earlier, of Julius Caesar. So let's go back to just before the first episode of this podcast. This is 55 BC, nearly a century before Claudius became the fourth emperor of the new Roman Principate. Julius Caesar is still alive in 55 BC. He's not dictator for life yet. He hasn't marched on Rome and crossed the Rubicon. In 55 BC, Julius Caesar was in the midst of his conquest of Gaul. Gaul overlaps quite a lot with modern France. But Caesar had become bogged down in Gaul, and he realized that the Celtic people that he was fighting were being supplied in part by these mysterious people that lived beyond the outer ocean and to the northwest of Gaul. So what Caesar did is he went to the English Channel and he sent scouts across the water, hoping to land on those chalky coastlines of the southeastern part of England. Now, one of the scouts that he sent came back after 5 days and indicated that he was not able to land on the shore. But Caesar decided to go ahead and attempt to take some of his soldiers across anyway. So he took 2 legions across the English Channel, and what he saw when he got there was probably a bit discouraging. And we have Caesar's own words to tell us what he saw. Now, Caesar writes in the third person, so you have to be aware of that. Quote, Caesar reached Britain with the first squadron of ships about the 4th hour of the day, and there he saw the forces of the enemy drawn up in arms on all the hills. The nature of the place was this: the sea was confined by mountains so close to it that a dart could be thrown from their summit upon the shore. Considering this by no means a fit place for disembarking, Caesar remained at anchor. That's Caesar's own words in his Gallic Wars. When Caesar finally did land a bit later, he faced an immediate battle from those Britons that were waiting for him. And in the next few weeks, a storm would then destroy several of the ships that were still in the English Channel. This was not like the water of the Mediterranean, which was quite calm during the campaign season. But still, even with these setbacks, Caesar was able to win some victories along the southeastern coast. He destroyed some fields and some settlements, but ultimately he left Britain as the cold began to set in near the end of the campaign season in 55 BC. And he really had not made any substantial gains. He would later take 5 legions and thousands of cavalry and around 200 ships in an invasion a couple of years later. And this expedition was far more successful, but again, Caesar did not leave any kind of permanent force on the island of Great Britain. So Caesar, in the words of the senator Tacitus, quote, revealed Britain to his descendants rather than bequeathed it. That's Tacitus, Agricola. So Caesar does not conquer Britain, but he makes it known to the Romans. And the Romans realize it's there. And maybe it's possible to conquer it at some point. But after Caesar left, there would not be a Roman expedition back to Britain for quite some time. And we know why the Romans were so preoccupied because you have listened to this podcast. The Pax Romana was born after the death of Caesar into a world of civil war. Caesar was assassinated. Octavian defeated his enemies and then his allies, becoming the first emperor, Augustus. And of course, you know the rest of the story about the emperors that follow. Rome was quite distracted over the next few decades. So when Claudius finally became emperor, and as you know, he had some major challenges and prejudices to overcome. He had to prove his worthiness pretty early on. Sure, Claudius had bought the empire from the Praetorian Guard, but there's a difference between buying an empire and actually earning the right to rule it. Claudius had not done that yet. So he settled on Britain as a territory ripe for conquest. And symbolically, that selection really made sense. By going to Britain, Claudius would join his reign to the legacy of Julius Caesar, one of the greatest military commanders in Roman history. And if Claudius could gain a permanent foothold on the island, he could claim to have done what even Caesar could not. So there are obviously huge potential symbolic rewards here, exactly the kind of victory that Claudius needed. And so the risk of failure was worth the expedition to Britain. But Julius Caesar invaded Britain in the middle of his Gallic wars with troops that were fiercely loyal to him and who would follow him just about anywhere. Claudius didn't have this kind of luxury. In fact, we're told by the senator Cassius that when the invasion of Britain was initially proposed to the soldiers that were closest to the border, quote, the soldiers were indignant at the thought of carrying on a campaign outside the limits of the known world. That's Cassius Dio's Roman history. So these indignant soldiers, and there were about 40,000 of them that were ultimately gathered to invade Britain, they had assembled under the command of a Roman senator near the English Channel. Claudius was not actually with these troops at the time. And we're not sure what happened. It seems like a spy or maybe an informant gave word to the British tribes on the southern part of Great Britain, and those tribes thus came to believe that the Romans were not actually going to invade. They decided not to line the coasts as when Caesar had invaded a century earlier. On the Roman side of the Channel, and we don't know how the Roman commander did it, but he convinced the soldiers to change their mind. And so when the Romans crossed the Channel, they were able to land on the shores of Great Britain with no serious opposition, which enabled them then to establish control over quite a bit of territory in the south of Great Britain, seemingly all the way up to the Thames River, that famous river that goes through now the modern city of London. So within that first year, Britain was not exactly subdued in total, but enough progress was made early on that now Claudius could travel over and take his moment on the stage. And it really was a performance, believe it. The emperor was ferried across the Channel with a train of senators who were there basically to witness his victory, so-called. And to add to the triumphal moment, Claudius's entourage also included some elephants. He probably brought those elephants to basically demoralize the Britons, to let them know the power and breadth of the empire that was coming to conquer them. This was an empire that stretched into lands with such giant beasts that probably seemed mythological almost to the British people. But again, Claudius didn't really come across to fight. He basically claimed to set foot on the land, to take credit for the victories that had been won by his subordinates, and then to head on back to Rome. And that's exactly what he did. Suetonius, in his biography of Claudius, says this, quote, "Without any battle or bloodshed, Claudius received the submission of a part of the island of Great Britain and returned to Rome within 6 months after first leaving the city. And he celebrated a triumph of great splendor." That's Suetonius' biography of Claudius. The emperor made a huge deal of the victory in Britain. He set up triumphal arches, one in Rome, one in the Gallic city of Lugdunum, and that's at the site of modern Lyon in France. We also know that statues were placed around the empire celebrating the victory, and we have one that still survives. It's in Asia Minor, and it shows the Emperor Claudius nude, which is not meant to embarrass him. This is a mark of divinity in ancient statuary, a nude figure. So it's a way to say that Claudius is like a sort of semi-divine Greek hero in a way, someone like Hercules, for example. And Claudius is in the statue nude, and he's standing dominant with the knee in the back of a female figure that's on the ground, and she is meant to represent Britannia. Claudius is holding a sword over her head, and the sword is missing in the statue, but we know it was there. And then his other hand is actually tugging on the hair of Britannia, and it's pulling it back from behind. And this, of course, exposes her neck as he's standing over there with this sword. Britannia is completely humiliated, and her weakness is really shown in the statue because as she's laying there, her clothing has either been torn or fallen off her, and her breasts have been exposed. And this is just another way to dehumanize her, to show Britannia as basically a piece of property to the conquering Claudius. So Claudius claimed a victory, obviously, and he passes out rewards for that victory. So the senator that he had put in charge of the invasion, for example, would get to become the first Roman governor of Britain. And that's both a reward and a responsibility. It's a responsibility in that he now has to continue to subdue more of the island in the name of Claudius, but he also gets the first opportunity to loot Great Britain. And that means a few different resources, but probably the most important of those were tin, which was found in some abundance in parts of what is now Wales, but also any captive slaves that were conquered in Britain could then be sold into slavery for a pretty hefty price. So this was a pretty good deal for this new governor. But despite the fact that Claudius claimed a victory, Britain was by no means subdued. Really, what had been won by the time Claudius left was a small portion of the island that the Romans could then use as a base of operations for further conquest. And further victories in other parts of Britain would come slowly and at great cost. It would in fact take decades for the Romans to subdue the better part of the island, and even then, the Romans never completely controlled Great Britain. The guerrilla tactics of the locals, the security offered by forests and hills, really ensured that the British warriors, even though they were outclassed in many ways by the Romans, would be able to continue to resist Roman pacification of their island. And in the end, the Romans would have to use what we might call genocidal tactics to really destroy all resistance to Roman rule on the island. And that included a successful attempt, unfortunately, to eliminate the Druids and the cultural and political power and really unity that they represented among tribes that were otherwise often fighting with each other. And the other thing is that Claudius's conquest of Great Britain never really seemed to impress the senators. so he didn't ever really win them over. The Roman people seemed to have loved it. Claudius had fulfilled the goal that he promised. He had expanded the Roman Empire, and his victory seemed like a sign that the gods were once again backing Rome after several years of the empire being effectively rudderless because of failed rule. And Claudius, of course, sweetened the deal. He held victory games, and he was more than just a casual fan of chariot racing and gladiator battles. And Claudius even held secular games again. Now, the 100 or 110 years of the saeculum had not actually completed yet. The cycle wasn't finished. So it wasn't technically time to hold those games. But again, Claudius really wanted to suggest to people that the good old days of Augustus were back. So Claudius was honored for this invasion and its initial success. And I want to mention one of the final rewards that he received. He was given the title Britannicus, and that basically means the one who conquered Britain. It was a similar title to the one that his brother had for conquering German people, that is Germanicus. But interestingly, Claudius decided not to add this title to his name, which he was perfectly entitled to do. Instead, he passed it on to his infant son, now named Britannicus. But Claudius had more than just that title and a new name in mind for this boy. He wanted to pass the empire on to him as well. But as we'll see next time, that was not destined to happen. Because according to our sources, Claudius had a major weakness: women. So how did this emperor, a man who was able to conquer parts of an island that even Caesar could not, how did this man ultimately find himself subdued and eventually killed by the women closest to him? Find out on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana Podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana Podcast.